introduction in chapter 1. Oh, you need one? Okay, chapter 1 of Christians at the Cross. You will find there, especially in chapter 1, a further explication of the four-part harmony that I taught about during the retreat. The bass line, the tenor line, the alto line, and the soprano line, the melody. Okay? You'll recall how Isaiah 53 provided the bass line that made the melody, or the story of the broken body and shed blood of Jesus, so transformative in the inner city of Los Angeles and in London. Okay, and if any of you were not there at that time and didn't get this, well, just a quick review. N.T. Wright suggests that the Old Testament provides the bass line, that the full story of Jesus is the melody, that the tenor carries the world or context in which we live, that tells us whether we're in a major or minor key, and the alto is our part, and it's a submissive part that must fit in with the other three. Now his is a much more elaborate and lovely explanation. He's a writer of music, and he has actually written, I think it's I can't remember what, it was a real nice big piece that was printed. So I'm going to wrestle with finding the alto part within the ministry of Jesus. That's really where I'm headed. And I think there are perennial and perpetual temptations concerning our part within God's story, our alto part within the song. And I think today's topic, the ministry of Jesus, provides a series of temptations that our current context particularly struggles with. So, how can the ministry of Jesus provide temptation in our current culture? Okay, the first temptation, I think, is the ministry of Jesus tempts us to truncate the gospel. That is, separate the life and teachings of Jesus from the full story and the meaning and purpose of the full story. While searching for authentic Christian hope after 18 years in urban ministry, I ran into the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and David Bosch. Now you probably know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer died because he would not remain silent when the Jews were being sent to concentration camps. He refused to fight in Hitler's war. Bosch, on the other hand, was a South African missiologist who risked his life numerous times, was threatened numerous times because of his work against apartheid. He had a seminary, actually, that had all kinds of different ethnic and minority groups meeting together. He died in a rather minor car accident in a black township, simply because, as the ambulance driver said, "Why didn't you tell me it was a white man?" So they let him bleed to death. Bonhoeffer and Bosch warned both of them. It was so fun to find both of these saying the same thing to me, that we would fail to share the good news of Jesus if we separated the various parts of the story and focused solely on one or the other. We need to hold the full story together. Bonhoeffer summarized it as follows, quote, "In the incarnation we learn of the love of God for his creation. In the crucifixion we learn of the judgment of God upon all flesh. And in the resurrection we learn of God's will for a new world. There could be no greater error than to tear these three elements apart, for each of them comprises the whole." He goes on to say something which I summarize. "In every time and place we need to discern the fitting response. Sometimes the incarnation will evoke affirmation and cooperation with the surrounding culture. Sometimes the crucifixion will remind us of the need for judgment and the possibility of rejection and suffering. Still other times, Christ's resurrection will inspire the boldness and creativity needed for a new life." Now, David Bosch challenged us this way. He says, "We need to live and proclaim the incarnate, crucified, resurrected, ascended, present among us in the Spirit, and taking us into the future as captives in his triumphal procession. Each of these impinges on all the others. Unless we hold on to this, we will communicate to the world a truncated gospel. Now, you may notice that neither of them name specifically the ministry of Jesus or the life and teachings of Jesus as a separate part. And I just heard a wonderful lecture by N.T. Wright about how even in the Apostles' Creed, we go straight from he lived, he was born, he died. We don't unpack this thing. Now, I happen to believe strongly that Bonhoeffer and Bosch understood the life and teachings of Jesus and lived discipleship fully. So for them, it may have been that the incarnation included not just God becoming man, but the life of Jesus and teachings. But these have often been omitted, and the Gospels have sometimes been seen just as preludes to the real event, namely the cross. I agree with Bonhoeffer and Bosch that no part of the story can be cut out, reduced, domesticated, or silenced without taming and misrepresenting the whole. I'm conscious of how readily we become groupies of our favorite part of the story. And you all know which one you're a groupie of. This does not mean that we tell the whole story every time we speak of Jesus, but it does invite us to hear each story in light of the whole story, or interpret what Jesus said and did in light of where the story is going and its purposes of the story. Now, okay, my personal confession of where I find my groupiness. I hold on to the crucified God, the Christ as a divine co-sufferer. And I was thrilled to read in Ephesians 4:9 that Christ had also descended into the lower parts of the earth. Christ has gone to the darkest hell. There is no human atrocity beyond his reach. I needed to know that. And sometimes for me, it seems that we're too eager to get rid of the blood and flesh and cross of Christ, because the risen Christ we follow doesn't look like he's just been to hell and back. And we don't realize that when he returned to the disciples, he was recognized by his wound. We don't follow an uncrucified Christ, in other words. I learned that from a speaker in Northern Ireland. I've never forgotten it. So, although I'm grateful that the eyes of my heart see this wounded Savior, I must remember to live in and live out the full story. I need to remember the resurrection. I need to remember the present and the future reign of Christ. I need the Spirit's life-giving power. I need the promised righteous, merciful judgment. I need to know that coming. I need the promised new creation. I need to think about these things as richly as I do the one I'm so familiar with. Okay, so the full story. That's our first temptation when we look at the life and teachings of Jesus, is to forget where this fits in the larger story and what the purpose of this part is. Our second temptation is our failure to understand the purpose and direction of the story. It's an absence of the telos. I keep running into this all over the place lately. We don't have a view or a vision of where this is going and where the story is going, where we're going, and so on. So, you might be surprised at what my understanding of telos is. But here, let me share something. I recently saw Jesus again. What I mean is that I glimpsed the glory of God revealed in Jesus at the early church here in Harrisonburg. Ken Wettig, the director of our community farms, that's the recovery ministry of the early church, was so overcome by the gospel, by the grace and the glory of God, that like the stream of beauty just flowed out of him. I think he'd done some prep on this, but it just flowed out. He says it this way: if Jesus is in town, or if he's coming your way, and he is, climb a tree if you have to, but make sure you see him. And if you're strong and height is not your problem, leave your net and your fishing business to follow him. Or if you're too sick and don't even have a job, push your way through the crush of the crowd to at least touch his garment. Or if you're lucky enough to get into the room with him, go ahead, waste your perfume on his feet and wipe them with your hair. But if you can't reach him because you're paralyzed and have given up hope, maybe your friends will cut a hole in the roof and drop you down in front of him. If worst comes to worst, gather the scraps under the table. They're infinitely better than nothing. But by all means, cry out, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. I was surprised, I was sobered, and I was satisfied. I saw the glory of God. The heaviness, the quantity, the quality, and the radiance. I glimpsed the glory of Jesus. I saw Jesus inviting himself into the house of an unwanted man, a thief. I saw him healing a tired, bleeding woman. I saw him raising a paralytic from his bed. I saw that he could make rough, coarse men into men of courage and wisdom and gentleness. And my heart and my mind wanted the list to just go on and on. I wanted to hear Jesus say, "Get up, little girl," to Jairus' daughter. I wanted to hear him demand of the demon, "Get out of him," so that the son could be returned to his father, never to be thrown into the fire again. I wanted to hear him say to the widow who had lost her only son, "Don't cry." And then I wanted Jesus to give her son back to her. I love that phrase in the scriptures, "Don't cry." It's just incredible. I keep wanting to hear that. I saw Jesus in living color, and I saw the glory of God revealed in Jesus. And I remembered that at his birth the angels sang glory, and I remembered the words, "They crucified the Lord of glory." And I remembered that he rose in glory, that he reigns in glory, and is coming in glory. I began to understand at a deeper level what the Hebrew word for glory really means. That's, remember from first semester? Kabod. Heaviness, weightiness, substantive, substantial, brilliant, radiant. The quantity, quality, and diffusion of God's being. I think the glory of God is our overarching purpose. It is the purpose statement we have in inner city ministry, and I believe that's why I lasted for 18 years. That I am here to honor and glorify God and delight in him in the inner city. And I know that someday the earth will be filled with the glory of God. And I know the end of the story, Revelation 21, where the glory of God has filled the whole new creation, and the light of Christ is the only light needed, and the nations will bring their glory into it. So that for me remains the toughest. When I need to remember this story of the life and ministry, the life and teachings of Jesus is focused on the glory of God. Temptation is to forget that. You'll see where I'm going soon. The third temptation is moralism, confusing our ministry with the ministry of Jesus. When reading the Gospels concerning the life and teachings of Jesus, the question so often that we go to is, what does this teach us that what we are to do as ministers or disciples of Jesus? And to whom are we to minister? We focus on our ministries, our calling, before deeply recognize that our ministry is not automatically the ministry of Jesus. We can easily move into doing the works of ministry without being God's instruments, without being bodies whose head is Christ, without being temples of the Spirit, without having the mind of Christ. Get it? And some of the ways this plays out is practicing hospitality without recognizing that it's only a social gathering unless Jesus is the host. Okay? It's moralism when we practice hospitality without recognizing that it's only a social gathering unless Jesus is the host. Or it can be played out by teaching about forgiveness and grace and mercy without confessing that the just judge of all both sheds light on our sinfulness and has provided for reconciliation and absolution. We can practice moralism by promising peace without introducing others to the one who is able to right all wrongs, the one who is our peace. Or failing to introduce, make known, or name the one who desires and is able to heal every kind of brokenness, the one who cleanses from those things that have taken the shine off of living, the one who frees those who are captives to things that we don't even like to think of, the one who illumines the truly dark places of this earth where manipulation, deceit, trickery, and shady business have robbed millions of abundance, or the one who enables the celebration of life in places where the thief has really stolen, killed, and destroyed. Which leads me then to the fourth, and it's very close to moralism. It is doing without being. And I was I would sometimes overstate this, but I was partially guilty of having a Messiah complex, of believing that if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. That God needed me, that I was the only hands and feet Jesus had. No. He could be one of a couple of different men. Renee and I didn't stay there long to celebrate her 17th birthday. My head was reeling because Renee had always struggled with insecurity. Who was she really? Where did she belong? Although her mother was mixed Hispanic and Caucasian, Renee clearly had African American blood in her. And so since her siblings had a black father, she was hoping that she belonged to them. And so she wanted to have the same father, but so this really confused her. And she loved that father, and she loved the grandmother from that side. Mm-hmm. So it was a hard one. But let me back up a little now. We were thrilled when Renee and her two sisters and her brother began attending our neighborhood youth clubs. They were delightful, bright, and eager. And it wasn't long before we learned that the children's mother was prostituting out of their home. She would say to them, if you want that, I need the extra money, I got to do this. So whenever I get a man in here, you just go get lost so that I can make some money. Anyway, that's probably why Renee's mother didn't know who the father was. Anyway. But I couldn't figure out why she would announce this to Renee on her birthday. Perhaps her mother thought Renee was now old enough to know the truth. Perhaps she decided to tell Renee in my presence because she knew I would work things through with Renee and help her to process it. But no matter when or how or where or with whom you learn bad news, it's still bad news. I understood more clearly that day why Renee had always struggled with who she was. As if her identity wasn't a big enough problem back then in that setting, she also had other childhood memories to deal with, like when one time she asked for a second piece of cake. And I guess her mother was feeling really poor at the time or something. She said, you asked for another piece of cake, and she took and rubbed the piece of cake into her hair and poured milk over her head. Said, that'll teach you not to ask for, it's just, anyway, but perhaps asking for seconds reminded Renee's mother of how hard it was to provide just enough, let alone seconds. Very possibly she resented Renee because she felt guilty about who Renee's father was. Mm-hmm. Families often project their anxiety onto the family member who embodies the family secret. Renee had reason to be bitter, or at least very sad. But you may have picked up that in the middle of all of this bad news, Renee had somehow ended up living in my home. How did that happen? Before I tell you about that, I want to point you to another story. This one from the 8th book in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. It reminds me of Renee's story. And it also begins with a lot of bad news. The book of Ruth opens with, in the days when the judges ruled. Remember what those days were like? The last verse in the book of Judges says, all the people did what was right in their own eyes. Sounds almost like they worshiped themselves. They did what was right in their eyes. Anyway, unfortunately, doing what was right in their own eyes is described 7 times in the book of Judges as, then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. How did this happen to the very people God had chosen, had rescued from slavery, had led into the promised land, the people with whom God had a covenant? Judges 2:10 explains how. Write this down. Judges 2:10. Moreover, that whole generation, the generation that entered the promised land, was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Why did the next generation not know? God's people had failed at their first missionary task, telling their own children the story. They didn't tell their children the stories of salvation, of walking through the Red Sea, of the manna and quails, of the cloud to shade them by day and the pillar of fire by night. Children who don't know the stories can turn to false securities and all kinds of selfishness and bitterness. So, our first mission field is our own children and our families, and then the children in our communities and down the road. But then there's more bad news at the beginning of the book of Ruth. It's also into this period of Israel's story that we're introduced to Naomi. On top of the evil of the time, Naomi and her husband and 2 sons were starving. Okay, so this is really bad. There's a famine in Israel. In desperation, Naomi and her family moved out of the promised land to Moab. They were refugees, foreigners, strangers among a people who did not know Israel's God. To make matters worse, Naomi's husband dies. Then within 10 years, her 2 sons die. Now, death is difficult enough no matter where you live, but if you're not around friends and you have no remaining family to support you, it becomes unbearable. So she's without protection, without a means of support, without the community's help, and without the people of God to walk with her. And this is where the good news then finally begins. When Naomi heard that the famine was finally over back in Israel, she decided to return. We all know the story of how one of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, listened to the voice of reason and chose to stay in Moab where she might find another husband. Ruth, on the other hand, chose to stay with Naomi. You'll remember from Ruth 1, verse 16, do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Now, why would Naomi choose to do such a gracious thing for a bitter mother-in-law? How many young women would give up their chances of security and remarriage and children and protection to go to a foreign country with their mother-in-law? I think Naomi's relationship with God starts to show up. As early as verse 6, we read that Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem because she had heard that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. Then later in verses 8 and 9, she blesses her daughters in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you security. Still later in verse 13, Naomi pleads with her daughters-in-law to leave, saying, the hand of the Lord. She keeps mentioning the Lord, her confidence that God is involved in all of her life, in the good and the bad, and her faith that God can continue to bless her daughters-in-law, even in Moab, shines in stark contrast to they did everything that was right in their own eyes. Judges. Naomi doesn't turn to false gods. She doesn't turn to the idols of Moab. She doesn't simply do what's right in her own eyes. She doesn't curse God or deny that he exists, even when things are indeed very sad. He is the Lord. Okay, and that's hard to do. I've had to learn that God is God and that I'm not. That's a hard lesson to learn. Even especially when the world around is full of death and famine and wars and all that murder, rape, terrorism. But Ruth must have seen Naomi's unshakable faith because she chooses Naomi's God. So I get the sense that Naomi must have been like a missionary in Moab for Ruth to choose this. Because it says that in verse 20 and 21, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of the women of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said, call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara. And now listen to this. For what? The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity on me? Why is she going back and forth with these two names? What do you think is happening? Anyway, throughout, she mostly has been calling him Lord, but here all of a sudden she's saying, the Almighty, the Almighty. Why does Naomi use this name now? Why does the writer of the book of Ruth use this different name? Why does she use the name Almighty when she's talking about bitterness and calamity? She says, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. Maybe the more intimate name, Lord, didn't feel right. Maybe she was grasping for God's strength by using the name El Shaddai, which is the name for Almighty. Maybe she's grasping for that strength. Perhaps she, unlike many in her generation, remembered the stories of God. And I say this because it's interesting. Almighty is only used 5 times prior to this in the early stories in the Pentateuch. It's only used 5 times. But you have to understand, this is an oral culture. So these stories are repeated and repeated, and then finally recorded way down the line. So when they hear the word Almighty, it would probably hark back to these 5 stories. So let me tell you what those 5 stories are really, really briefly. It appears first in Genesis 17, verse 1, when 99-year-old Abraham doesn't have any children. God reveals himself as El Shaddai, the one who can make a very old man and a woman who is past childbearing years and make them fruitful. Remember, Naomi is an old woman with no children any longer, with no heirs. So maybe she's thinking God can fill her emptiness. Could be. The second time Almighty appears is in Genesis 28, when Isaac, who is in a foreign land at the time, sends Jacob to go find a wife among the people of God. Jacob encounters El Shaddai, the Almighty, when again